Hi, it's me back again. This is my cat Jasper in a cushion. Jasper died a year ago, so this is in memory of him. Greatly missed. I said I'd finish with Glacier View, but of course here I am back again. And for two reasons. An interesting thing is that if you actually do a history project, then you think about it and you want to come back to it. And the first thing I wanted to say was that I thought about what I said about Smuts on video number 5, I think it was. Yeah, it was number 5. And I thought, well, I was told what happened to Smuts. I better check with him. So I wrote to Smuts and asked him, did I represent you properly in saying how you left Andrews? Because I said he was fired over Mephibosheth, which was a good joke, but actually not quite right. So behind my iPad, I have on screen his email, so I'm going to be looking up to read it. I may make some comments in the middle. Hi Gill, here are a few basics regarding my departure from Andrews. 1. The initial cause was my part in the establishment of Evangelica. As I've mentioned, this is an aside, Evangelica was a magazine put out by gospel people at Andrews around in 1980, I guess, after Glacier View. And apparently Smuts was very much part of developing Evangelica, and I hadn't known that. He says I had suggested the name. The University of South Africa's Department of Religion has a journal called Theologica Evangelica as the equivalent of seminary studies at Andrews. It became the inspiration for Evangelica. At the time of Glacier View, I was not teaching, but on leave doing my THD at UNISA. Don't know where that is. I therefore did not attend Glacier View. After Glacier View, a group of faculty and seminary students met in the seminary chapel to write a letter of protest to send to Neil Wilson. The faculty members, a dozen or so, helped the students clarify the language, but refused to sign it. I told you that a number of the schools sent petitions, and many of them did sign it. But the ones at Andrews were wise not to, because they were able to keep their jobs. Smuts says he was the only faculty member out of a dozen or so to sign it. And my signature is, I believe, the first on the list. We then decided not to send the letter to Neil by itself, but to make a little journal and send that out to everybody. Robert Brinsmead provided the mailing list, and a seminary faculty member raised the funds for the enterprise from a wealthy supporter. 2. I was conversant with the issues of the investigative judgment from the writing of Bob Brinsmead and had not read any of Des's work. So I'd said he knew nothing. This is an aside. I'd said that Smuts knew nothing about the investigative judgment when he arrived at Good News, and that the men there, that would have been Calvin and Noel, and I suppose Des, taught him. But when I mentioned that to Des, he knew that Smuts already knew about the investigative judgment. So I either misremembered it or I was misinformed. And Smuts says, my concern was for the implications for the atonement that the investigative judgment nullified with its provisional forgiveness, followed by a later blotting out of sins that had been confessed and overcome. And I mentioned that somewhat in my earlier tapes, that you really can't believe in the gospel of righteousness by faith and also believe in the investigative judgment. Smuts continues, the investigative judgment, in my view, is not an eschatological discussion, but a new soteriology, meaning eschatology is to do with the end times. So it's not just discussing, the investigative judgment is not just discussing what happens at the end of the world, but Smuts says it's giving us a new theory about salvation, and he says it's a false gospel. Well, this is an aside. I feel better about saying that Herb Douglas's view of the nature of Christ implied a false gospel. I was right after all. The exegetical foundation of the investigative judgment were of modest interest to Smuts, and frankly they bored me. It was clear to me that the investigative judgment is a false soteriology, that's the study of salvation, and it undermines the cross. And Smuts says, I think Good News Unlimited, where he worked for a brief time before he went back into the church work, I think Good News should have given that issue far more emphasis than it did. Another aside, which shows Des never made a lot of the investigative judgment and rarely preached on it since, and Smuts clearly wishes that he had made more of it. 3. The GC decided to deal with the protests at Andrews University by making a list of suspected faculty and having them meet one at a time with Max Torkelson and Grady Smoot. Torkelson was the new chairman of the university board, and Smoot was the university president. I was the first that they interviewed. After a few niceties, I was asked what I thought of the investigative judgment. I replied, I could not reconcile it with the teaching of Hebrews, which clearly said that Christ had entered the most holy place at his ascension and sat down at the right hand of God once for all to make atonement for us. Smoot then objected that it was contrary to Ellen White, and Smuts replied, if I was given a choice between Ellen White and Hebrews, I would have to go with Hebrews. Smoot said, but that's your word against Ellen White's word. And Smuts replied, I do not see Ellen White in the room. What is really happening here is that my word stands opposed to your word. This is a conversation between us. At this point, Smoot said he did not see how I could continue teaching at Andrews University, and Smuts took that to mean he was fired and said he should take his leave and left the room. And he says that Max Torkelson sat in silence during the discussion. I had the same experience in the Friday afternoon meeting at Glacier View. I thought that Des was fired because the terms of it were discussed. And I got told off afterwards for saying it, but they did fire him within 2 or 3 weeks, so it was just a matter of words and definitions. 4. The next day, Grady Smoot called me and said he had not fired me, that I had upset the faculty by telling them a falsehood, since only the board may fire a teacher. And I asked him what conclusion I should have drawn from his statement. He said, from the statement, I don't see how you can continue teaching at Andrews University. He looked confused, but finally said there'd been a misunderstanding. 5. A few days later, The provost of the university and my academic dean, Arthur Coetzee, called me in and told me as a friend that the university would not fire me, but would not rehire me the next year. He suggested that if I wanted to make a protest, I should resign, which is what I did, and all hell broke loose on campus. But that is another story. All is of grace. Signed, Smuts.